Every single time it looks like the Cleveland Browns are finally getting their act together at the most important position in football, something comes flying out of nowhere and blows the whole thing up again. And right now, we are sitting at one of those exact moments. The kind where everybody thinks they already know how the story ends. Everybody thinks they've already figured out who the odd man out is, and then the front office does something that makes the entire fan base lose their minds all over again. That's where we are with this Browns quarterback room heading into 2026, and if you think you already know what's coming, you might want to think again. For weeks now, the dominant narrative around this team has been locked in on one storyline, one player that most people assumed was automatically the most likely to get moved before the season even kicks off. Fans had made up their minds, analysts had made up their minds, even some people inside the building were operating like the decision had already been made. But behind the scenes, the word is quietly growing that Cleveland could go in a completely different direction. And if that happens, if the Browns actually pull the trigger on the move that most people aren't expecting, this fan base is going to split right down the middle in a way we haven't seen in a long time. What makes this whole thing even more intense is the timing of it. This isn't just any offseason in Cleveland. This is one of the most consequential offseasons this organization has had in years. New offensive system coming in, new pressure from ownership and the fan base, massive expectations after years of disappointment, and a quarterback room sitting right in the middle of it all, full of question marks, full of unfinished stories, and full of guys who all believe they deserve to be the answer. Somewhere inside that room, somebody is almost certainly not making it to Week 1 in Cleveland, and the terrifying part? The player that most fans believe is completely safe might not be safe at all. The tension is already building. Mandatory minicamp is right around the corner. The Browns know they need answers, and they need them fast, because the way these next few weeks shake out could completely change the direction of this franchise heading into the season. Browns fans know this better than anyone. This organization has a long, painful history of making the move nobody expected, and right now, all the signs are pointing toward another one of those moments. Let's start with what we actually know about this quarterback situation, because understanding the full picture is important before anything else. You have Deshaun Watson back and healthy, coming in as the heavy favorite to be the starter when training camp opens. That part of the story isn't really in dispute. Watson is the veteran, he's the guy this franchise committed to in a massive way, and on paper, he walks in with the top spot on the depth chart until someone takes it from him or something goes wrong. But underneath Watson, the real drama lives, and that's where this gets genuinely complicated. You have Dillon Gabriel, a third-round pick who started 6 games last season and gave the Browns stretches of functional, if unspectacular, quarterback play. Then you have Shedeur Sanders, a second-year player who started 7 games and brought a level of energy and explosive potential that had the fan base genuinely buzzing at certain points during an otherwise miserable stretch of the season. And then there's Talon Green, the rookie the Browns took in the 6th round, a player with athleticism off the charts who Cleveland clearly views as a long-term developmental investment. 4 quarterbacks, 3 realistic roster spots, and a front office that knows every single decision they make this summer is going to be dissected and argued about for months. The math alone makes this a nightmare. You can't keep all 4, at least in any traditional sense. The roster has needs everywhere, and carrying 4 quarterbacks into the regular season while the team is trying to compete would raise serious questions about how Cleveland is allocating resources. So something has to give, someone has to go. And the question that's consuming Browns circles right now is simple. Who is it? For the longest time, the answer felt obvious. Dillon Gabriel, the third-round pick who doesn't fit the prototypical NFL quarterback mold in terms of size, who still has a long way to go to convince the broader football world he can be more than a career backup. He was the easy answer. He was the guy most people had mentally moved out of Cleveland already. But that assumption is starting to crack. And the reason it's cracking has everything to do with what Shedeur Sanders has quietly been building around himself both on and off the field.
Before we go any further into what could happen, it's important to understand what already happened, because the 2025 season gave us real, actual game tape and real, actual numbers on both Sanders and Gabriel, and those numbers tell a story that doesn't cut cleanly in either direction. Gabriel started 6 games, Sanders started 7. On the surface, that looks like a near-even split, but the texture of those two stretches of play was very different, and anyone who watched closely knows it. Sanders had the kind of moments that make you sit up straight. The arm talent was there. The creativity outside of structure was there. The confidence in the pocket, the ability to make something out of nothing when the play broke down. Those were real. The offense looked different when he was behind center. It had more life, more unpredictability, more of the kind of electricity that makes an offense genuinely hard to defend. The fan base responded to it. The locker room responded to it. You could feel the energy shift when Sanders was playing well. And in Cleveland, where the fan base has been starved for something to believe in at quarterback for what feels like forever, that energy matters more than most outsiders understand. When you've watched your team cycle through quarterback after quarterback for 2 decades, every flash of genuine potential hits different, and Sanders gave Browns fans real flashes. But here's the other side of that coin, and it's a side that the front office absolutely cannot ignore. Sanders threw 10 interceptions during his stretch of starts. 10. For context, Gabriel threw just 2. Now, some of those Sanders turnovers were aggressive throws in situations where the offense needed a spark, and you can make the argument that a certain level of aggression is exactly what you want from a developmental quarterback who's learning on the fly. That's fair. But 10 interceptions in 7 starts is still 10 interceptions in 7 starts. That's a rate that will get you benched in the NFL if it continues. That's a rate that puts your defense in impossible situations. Kevin Stefanski's staff knew it. The new coaching staff knows it. And Todd Monken, the new offensive coordinator, who is now the most important voice in this quarterback evaluation, is absolutely going to factor it in when he makes his assessments this summer. The turnover issue was real. The potential is also real. That's the honest truth about Shedeur Sanders right now. He's a player who can make you look brilliant for keeping him and crazy for trading him, sometimes within the same game. And in the NFL, players like that are simultaneously the most exciting and the most frustrating to have in your building. Gabriel, by contrast, was steadier, more conservative, less likely to make the throw that costs you the game, but also less likely to make the throw that wins it for you. His game grade never scared anyone in either direction. He was functional. He was professional about his role. He didn't throw the ball to the wrong team 10 times. But he also didn't make anybody forget they were watching a backup quarterback. The upside ceiling with Gabriel is lower, and that's the honest reality of his situation. The league around him is largely settled on what he is, and what he is doesn't have a lot of teams calling Cleveland to ask about his availability at any price that would move the needle. Here's where the whole evaluation flips, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention in these quarterback conversations. Todd Monken, the man coming in to run this offense, changes the dynamics of literally everything we just talked about, and understanding why requires understanding what a new offensive coordinator actually means for a quarterback room. When a completely new offensive system comes into a building, every quarterback on the roster essentially starts from scratch. It doesn't matter what you showed last year, at least not entirely. What matters is how quickly and how effectively you can absorb the new system, install the new concepts, and demonstrate that you can run what the new coordinator actually wants to run. Monken's offense has specific demands, specific reads, specific timing, specific traits he prioritizes at the quarterback position. And the evaluation of Sanders, Gabriel, and even Watson is going to run through that lens now. That's actually, in a strange way, good news for Sanders, because it wipes the slate clean in the most important sense. The 10 interceptions from last season don't define the conversation anymore. What defines it is what you show Monken, and early reports out of Cleveland are genuinely interesting on that front. Word coming out of the facility suggests Sanders has been competing hard for the starting job and looks like the QB2 at worst, which, if accurate, is a significant statement about how he's handled himself in the early stages of this transition. Coaches notice when a player shows up locked in under a new system. It tells you something about the character of the player and about whether they genuinely want to be there.
But here's the complexity. Monken can be as impressed with Sanders right now, and the front office can still be having a completely separate conversation in a completely different direction. Because coaching staff evaluations and organizational roster-building decisions don't always run on the same track. The front office has to think bigger picture. They have to think about what makes this roster the most competitive in 2026, what the quarterback room looks like in 2027 and beyond, and whether the best use of Shedeur Sanders is as a Cleveland Brown or as trade capital that brings back something else the team needs. And this is where the uncomfortable reality starts to surface, because the front office might look at Sanders right now and see something that won't be there later. They might see a player who still has enough mystery around his game, still has enough developmental upside in the eyes of the rest of the league to generate real trade interest. Interest that won't exist in the same way in another year or two after more tape accumulates and the picture becomes clearer. In the NFL, the window to move a player for maximum value is almost always shorter than it looks, and Cleveland's front office is smart enough to know that. Nobody in Cleveland wanted to be sitting here talking about this. That's the honest truth. After everything this fanbase went through last season, after watching Sanders inject something real into a team that had nothing going for it at the time, the idea of trading him before this season even starts feels like an organizational gut punch. But here we are, because this is the NFL, and the NFL doesn't care about feelings. The trade conversation around Sanders exists for one simple reason. He probably has more real trade value right now than Dillon Gabriel. That's not an insult to Sanders, it's actually a reflection of his upside. Teams around the league look at Gabriel and see a backup. They've seen enough. He's a quality professional, he handles himself the right way, but the market for him isn't exactly burning hot. Cleveland isn't going to get a second-round pick for Dillon Gabriel. They're not getting a first, obviously. They're probably not even getting a meaningful third. If Gabriel gets traded, it's for depth, for a day 3 pick, for something that fills a roster need but doesn't change the calculus of the franchise. Sanders is different. Teams around the league can still talk themselves into what he could be. They can watch those flashes of arm talent and creativity and convince themselves that in the right system, with the right development, Sanders is a starting caliber quarterback. That belief, even if it's speculative, even if it doesn't hold up to deeper scrutiny, generates phone calls, it generates offers, it generates the kind of trade market that could at least bring back a real asset, maybe a day 2 pick if Cleveland gets fortunate, or some combination of picks and players that actually matters. Winston Wilcox has pointed out that there are already people around the league who believe Sanders is more likely to be traded out of Cleveland than to be the Browns' Week 1 starter. That's a significant data point, not because everyone agrees with it, but because the fact that it's even being said at this stage of the offseason tells you something about how the situation is being perceived around the league. Zach Jackson of The Athletic has also weighed in, suggesting that Monken will set up some kind of depth chart structure before training camp and that Watson figures to open at the top. If that happens, and if the depth chart falls the way most people expect, the speculation around Sanders' future is only going to get louder as camp approaches. The question Cleveland has to answer is whether they're moving Sanders because they genuinely don't believe in him, or because they're trying to maximize value at a moment when the market is at its peak. Those are two very different decisions with very different consequences, and getting that question wrong in either direction could haunt this franchise for years. Before anyone starts treating a Sanders trade as the obvious move, there are serious arguments on the other side that deserve real attention. Because trading Shedeur Sanders this summer is not the clean, logical decision that some people are making it out to be. It's a high-risk move that could leave the Browns dangerously exposed in ways that won't be fully apparent until it's too late to fix.
Start with Deshaun Watson, the presumed franchise quarterback, the guy who is walking into training camp as the starter, the guy this organization made an enormous financial and roster commitment 2 years ago. Watson is 30 years old. He has come off 2 straight Achilles injuries. 2. Let that sink in for a second. We are talking about a quarterback who has had back-to-back serious lower body injuries that required full surgical repair and extended rehabilitation. Even if Watson shows up this summer looking healthy, looking sharp, looking like the player Cleveland hoped they were getting when they traded for him, and there's reason for optimism on that front, the injury risk doesn't just disappear because he had a good training camp. The NFL is violent, the season is long, and quarterbacks coming off the injury history Watson is carrying are operating on a shortened margin for error when it comes to their bodies. If Watson goes down again, and nobody wants that, but the possibility has to be considered seriously in any honest roster conversation, the Cleveland Browns need a quarterback who can actually play, not just a placeholder, not just someone to manage the offense until the cavalry arrives. They need someone who can keep this team competitive, who the coaching staff believes in, who the fan base can rally behind while the starter is recovering. Right now, Shedeur Sanders is that guy. He's on a cheap rookie contract, he has starting experience from last season, the locker room has responded positively to him, and despite the turnovers, the underlying talent is real enough that the broader organization can make a case for running with him. If Cleveland trades Sanders and Watson gets hurt again, the Browns are looking at Dillon Gabriel leading a team with playoff aspirations, or they're scrambling to sign a veteran free agent at mid-season market prices, giving up future assets to bring in someone who fits even less with what the offense is trying to do. Neither of those scenarios is acceptable for a franchise that is genuinely trying to compete, and the price Cleveland would get back for Sanders, most realistic projections have it somewhere in the late day 2 to day 3 range, maybe a couple of picks, doesn't come close to offsetting the risk the team would be taking by eliminating their most capable backup option. There's another layer to this too, and it's about the optics of the decision as much as the football logic. Cleveland traded up to get Shedeur Sanders in the 2025 draft. They gave up assets to move to the spot where they could take him. The organizational messaging around that selection was about finding the future of the franchise, about finally landing a quarterback who could be part of the long-term answer. Moving him less than one full season into his NFL career before he's even had a real chance to learn from a full training camp under a consistent system sends a message to the rest of the league. It tells every future quarterback prospect in the draft that Cleveland isn't a place that's going to develop you. It tells agents and players around the league that this organization makes emotional, reactive decisions at the most important position. That's a reputation that follows a franchise, and the Browns are already fighting enough perception battles without adding that one to the pile. Here's where the conversation gets really interesting, because while everyone has been focused on Sanders as the trade candidate, there's a growing case to be made that Dillon Gabriel is actually the cleaner, smarter move if Cleveland decides to thin out the quarterback room this summer. Start with the money. Gabriel, based on his draft position, is making more than Sanders on their current contracts. In an NFL environment where roster efficiency matters enormously, paying more for a player who sits lower on your depth chart is never ideal. The Browns are not a team swimming in financial flexibility right now. Every dollar on the roster needs to justify itself, and Gabriel's contract situation makes him a logical candidate if the team is looking to create space and clarity at the same time. Then there's the depth chart reality. By most accounts coming out of Cleveland, Sanders has already moved above Gabriel in the unofficial pecking order heading into this offseason. That's not just the coaching staff being diplomatic, that's the actual evaluation of what the team has in each player. If Sanders is QB2 and Gabriel is QB3, you're paying QB3 money for a player who is 3 spots away from seeing the field in a meaningful way. That math starts to become difficult to justify.
From a trade perspective, the honest answer is that Gabriel doesn't generate the same kind of market buzz as Sanders. We already covered that. But there are still teams around the league looking for experienced backup options, for players who have started NFL games and won't completely fall apart if they get thrown into action. Gabriel fits that profile. He's competent, he's professional, and for a team that needs a steady veteran option at low cost, he represents something real. Cleveland might not get a lot back for him, but whatever they do get cleans up the roster, keeps Watson and Sanders together, and preserves the developmental setup the Browns presumably envisioned when they drafted both of these young quarterbacks. And then there's Talon Green, the 6th-round pick who keeps getting overlooked in these conversations. The Browns didn't take Green by accident. You don't spend a draft pick on a quarterback just to have him sit on the practice squad and never develop. Cleveland took him because the athletic profile jumped off the page during the evaluation process. The arm, the mobility, the frame, the projection, everything that scouts look for when they're trying to identify a quarterback who could grow into something bigger over time, Green has it. He's not going to be part of the immediate QB competition for the starting job. That's not a realistic conversation right now. But he's almost certainly making this roster in 2026, and the presence of Green makes the case for keeping 3 quarterbacks on the active roster that much stronger. If you think about it from a pure roster construction standpoint, the ideal Browns quarterback room right now might actually be Watson, Sanders, and Green. Watson is the starter, Sanders is the experienced backup who can win games if something goes wrong, Green as the long-term developmental project who the Browns are genuinely excited about and want to protect. That's a coherent vision. That's a room that makes sense both for 2026 and for what comes after. And Gabriel, in that scenario, becomes the odd man out, not because of anything he did wrong, but simply because of where the roster is heading and what the team needs at each level of the depth chart. Here's the part of this conversation that most football analysts want to skip over, because emotions aren't supposed to factor into front office decisions. And they're right that purely emotional thinking leads to bad roster management. But there's a version of understanding the emotional dimension of this that actually matters from a practical standpoint, and Cleveland's front office would be foolish to dismiss it entirely. Shedeur Sanders did something last season that goes beyond statistics. He gave a suffering fan base something real to hold on to during a stretch of the season when the Cleveland Browns had almost nothing else going for them. When the offense was struggling, when the team was losing, when the energy in the building had dropped to a level that made games feel almost unwatchable, Sanders came in and changed the temperature of the situation. Not every game, not perfectly, but in those moments, the fan base felt it, the locker room felt it, the team came alive in a way that it simply hadn't been before, and that kind of energy is genuinely difficult to manufacture. You can't scheme it up, you can't recruit it in free agency. It either lives in a player naturally or it doesn't. Shedeur Sanders has it. That's not a statistical argument, that's an observation about what he does to the people around him when he's playing well, and it's the kind of intangible that championship organizations have learned to value even when it doesn't show up in a box score. Trading a player who carries that energy, trading him before the current fan base even gets to see what he can do in a full training camp under a real offensive coordinator with a healthy roster around him, is the kind of decision that alienates a city. And in Cleveland, where the relationship between the fan base and the franchise has been complicated for decades, making a move that feels like the team is giving up on a young quarterback that people genuinely connected with could do real, lasting damage to the trust that's been painstakingly rebuilt in recent years. None of that means Cleveland should keep Sanders for emotional reasons if the front office genuinely believes he isn't the future at the quarterback position. That would be bad organizational management, plain and simple. The cold reality of the NFL is that sentiment doesn't win football games, and building a roster around how fans feel about specific players is a fast track to mediocrity. If the Browns look at Sanders after everything they've seen and decide he isn't their long-term answer at quarterback, then trading him is the correct business decision, regardless of how the fan base reacts. That's what professional sports organizations have to do sometimes, and the teams that get soft about those decisions are the ones that end up stuck in the middle, not good enough to win, not willing to make the uncomfortable moves to get better.
But understanding the emotional dimension matters because it shapes how Cleveland frames the decision publicly, how they communicate it to the fan base, and whether they do it in a way that respects what Sanders brought to the table during his time in Cleveland. The city deserves honesty, the player deserves honesty, and a franchise that handles these moments with transparency and directness builds more long-term trust than one that hides behind press release language and corporate non-answers. This is the most honest thing that can be said about the Browns' quarterback situation right now. There is no outcome that everyone is going to be happy with. Every single scenario has a significant portion of the fan base ready to lose their minds, and the front office is going to have to make their decision knowing that no matter what they do, the criticism is coming. If Watson wins the starting job outright and Cleveland rolls into the season with him as the clear QB1, there are going to be fans who feel like the Browns are just delaying the inevitable. Watson is 30, he's coming off serious injuries, his best football is likely behind him, and every game he starts is a game that Sanders or Green isn't developing. The fans who believe Cleveland needs to be building toward the next quarterback, not prolonging the current one, are going to be vocal, and they're going to be relentless. Every Watson incompletion, every game where the offense stagnates, every 3rd and long that goes nowhere is going to become a rallying point for the crowd that says the Browns should have been developing their young guys all along. If Sanders gets traded, a different but equally passionate group is going to absolutely go ballistic. The people who watched him play last year, who felt that energy shift when he took the field, who projected all of their hopes for this franchise's future onto what he showed in those 7 starts, they're going to view a trade as organizational betrayal. They're going to ask why Cleveland gave up assets to draft him if they weren't going to give him a real shot. They're going to compare it to every other time this franchise has given up on a young quarterback too early, and there are enough historical examples to make that argument feel credible, even if the facts of this specific situation don't fully support it. Social media is going to be chaotic in a way that even Browns fans who are used to chaos aren't fully prepared for. If Gabriel is the one who gets traded instead, the reaction is going to be more muted, but still significant. The people who believed Gabriel was the right fit, the people who liked his decision-making and his lower risk profile, are going to argue that Cleveland is choosing the flashier option over the more reliable one. There will be takes about how turnovers kill teams, and how the Browns are setting themselves up for a disaster if Watson gets hurt, and they're running Sanders out there again with his interception tendencies on full display. And honestly, those takes aren't completely without merit, they're just the wrong conclusion for reasons we've already covered. And then there's the Talon Green wildcard, the scenario where Green comes into training camp and does something completely unexpected, where the athletic tools translate into actual on-field production faster than anyone projected, where he outperforms one of the established quarterbacks, and suddenly the Browns are dealing with a conversation nobody had on their bingo card heading into this summer. It's unlikely, it's genuinely the longest of long shots, but in Cleveland, where the unexpected has a way of becoming the norm, the possibility exists, and if it happens, the quarterback room becomes a chaos of a different kind entirely, one where now you have a legitimate 4-way conversation happening, and the front office has to figure out which of the veterans makes the least sense to keep on the roster. Here's where everything lands. Cleveland Browns ownership and the front office are going to make a decision about this quarterback room in the coming weeks, and that decision is going to tell you more about the direction of this franchise than almost anything else they do this offseason. Because it's not just about 2026, it's about the entire trajectory of this organization going forward. The Deshaun Watson era in Cleveland is winding down in one form or another, whether it ends this season with a trade or a release, or whether Watson plays out the rest of his deal and the Browns move on naturally. The post-Watson era is coming faster than most people want to acknowledge. That means the decisions Cleveland makes right now about Sanders and Gabriel and Green are actually decisions about who is going to be leading this franchise after Watson. They're decisions about whether the Browns are going to have a young, capable quarterback ready to step in when that transition happens, or whether they're going to find themselves back in the same position they've been in so many times before, scrambling at the most important position in sports, throwing assets at veterans that don't move the needle, and hoping that the next draft class produces the answer.
The Sanders conversation is really a proxy conversation for that bigger question. If Cleveland keeps him, develops him, and builds the kind of competition and support structure around him that gives him a real chance to grow into a starting quarterback, they're making a bet on the future.
A bet that says, we think this kid has something real. We're going to find out, and we're going to give him every chance to prove it before we make any final decisions. That bet might not pay off. Sanders might never be more than a quality backup, but at least the organization can say they did their due diligence. At least the fan base can feel like the team didn't pull the plug before the story had a chance to play out. If Cleveland moves him now, they're making a different kind of bet. They're betting that the return value they get in a trade is worth more to this roster right now than the potential upside of a young quarterback who still has real developmental room. They're betting that Gabriel or Green or some future acquisition is enough depth insurance behind Watson, and that the assets they get back for Sanders will help them compete in 2026 in a more meaningful way. That bet might be right too. The front office has information that fans don't have. They've been in the building, they've seen Sanders in practice, they've had the private conversations with Monken about what he sees in the young quarterback. If those conversations haven't been encouraging, then moving Sanders for whatever the market will bear makes sense, even if it's painful. What Cleveland cannot afford to do is make this decision based on anything other than a cold, honest assessment of what each quarterback actually is and what the team genuinely needs. The pressure from the media, the noise from the fan base, the emotional weight of Sanders' performance last season, none of that can be the driving force. The driving force has to be the football evaluation and the organizational vision for what this team is trying to build. Get that part right, and the rest of the conversation sorts itself out. Get it wrong, and Cleveland is back in the same cycle they've been in for 20 years. When you pull back from all of it, the numbers, the trade speculation, the coaching staff reports, the emotional weight of what Sanders did last season, the honest conclusion is that trading Shedeur Sanders before this season would create more questions than answers for Cleveland. Not because he's definitely the future, not because the front office has some obligation to keep him regardless of what the evaluation says, but because the Watson injury risk is real. The return value doesn't match the roster risk, and the developmental story with Sanders hasn't had enough time to reach any kind of definitive conclusion. The Gabriel trade, if Cleveland decides to trim the quarterback room, makes considerably more sense from just about every angle you look at it. The money, the depth chart positioning, the upside differential, the fit with the organizational vision of developing young quarterbacks, all of it points toward Gabriel being the odd man out rather than Sanders. That's not a knock on Gabriel, it's just where the roster math leads when you follow it honestly. But this is the Cleveland Browns we're talking about. This is a franchise that has made the unexpected move so many times that the unexpected has almost become expected. The history of this organization is littered with decisions that left fans stunned, decisions that broke with conventional wisdom, decisions that the front office was absolutely convinced were right, and that often turned out to be something else entirely. Nobody who has watched this team for any length of time would be genuinely shocked if Cleveland went in a direction that contradicts everything being discussed right now.
Which is exactly why this quarterback room conversation isn't going anywhere. Not through minicamp, not through training camp, not until someone is clearly winning the starting job and the depth chart is settled enough that the front office has to commit to a specific direction. Until then, every practice rep, every report out of Berea, every comment from Monken or Watson or Sanders himself is going to get analyzed and dissected and argued about across every platform where Browns fans gather to process their collective anxiety about this franchise. And maybe that's actually the most Cleveland thing about this whole situation. A fan base that cares so deeply, that has been through so much disappointment, that can't help but invest emotionally in every quarterback conversation, because every quarterback conversation might be the one that finally changes everything. Sanders, Gabriel, Watson, Green, they're all carrying the weight of that history right now, whether they know it or not. And somewhere in that quarterback room, the future of this franchise is quietly taking shape. Whether Cleveland gets it right this time is the only question that actually matters. The Browns have a chance to make the smart decision here. The chess pieces are in place, the information is available, the evaluation window is open. What happens next is entirely up to the people inside that building, and every single Browns fan in the world is watching.